Okay, we're on to the first section of chapter 11. We're talking about imperialism, specifically European imperialism in Africa. Our lesson essential question, what changes resulted from European imperialism? So one of the things we notice right off the bat when we look at the map of Africa is how much it changed and how European countries dominated Africa, starting in the mid to late 1800s and then through the world wars. Now, what you'll have this piece of paper right here. This is to assist you in your note taking. It's for that. It's not necessarily a graphic organizer. If you want to look at it that way, you sure can. And you'll notice that it matches up with the sections in the book. So we're starting on page 339. And the first section on here is called Africa Before European Domination. Keep in mind a few things. Before European domination of Africa, we're talking about the period leading all the way up until about the mid-1800s. Europeans had contact with Africa. It was just mostly around the shores, around the shoreline. The Europeans did not penetrate much into Africa. In fact, there weren't even a lot of good maps on the interior of Africa. Some of the reasons, well, there were still African people living there, and they had guns, and and they had civilizations in these areas. A few other things to note is that the rivers that are in Africa were not navigable. There were basically waterfalls and different things that you couldn't really get upriver very much. That was a problem there. And then your book talks about disease. The biggest thing about disease was malaria, and Europeans died from malaria in pretty big numbers. So that kept away. But eventually, there were reasons to get to the interior of Africa. Your book talks about the Congo. Okay, so also you can also follow along with this on your phone. The PowerPoint is loaded up on my school website, so you can follow along with that. If you miss something, go back and get it. So you don't have to try to write everything down at that time. But we're talking about right here, the very top, Africa before European domination. Okay, there were problems that discouraged exploration before like 1880. Okay, all right. So that's there. Next, Congo. So there's an area in the very middle of Africa called the Congo. And in that area, there were a lot of wild rubber trees. So as part of the Industrial Revolution, there was, at this point in the 1880s, there was a lot of rubber needed. So there was interest in the Congo. And the Belgian king, King Leopold II, he was the one that started to imperialize the interior of Africa. Here, the Belgian Congo. Okay. One of the famous quotes, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, when Henry Stanley was looking for Dr. Livingstone, and there's a much longer story to go with that later. Next, we're looking at forces that drive imperialism, or as it says here, forces driving imperialism. Okay. The need for raw materials and markets for finished products. I've said before that imperialism is kind of like colonialism on steroids. There was a big demand for raw materials. We were in the Industrial Revolution at this time. And nationalism, these European countries, nationalism is a big. You've got to put nationalism down there. You've got to have something about the Industrial Revolution. All right. Also, there were technological innovations that helped Europeans. The steam engine, the machine gun, which there was a guy named Maxim, so with the Maxim machine gun, and quinine. Quinine helped with the effects of malaria. So those are things that eventually led to the interior of Africa being developed. Okay. Next, we've got. I'm going right here. I can't stop this. Next, we've got the more notes here on driving forces of imperialism. Of course, we talked about nationalism. And the other thing your book talks about is racism and social Darwinism. Okay, so and this racism kind of goes along with nationalism a little bit, these European countries. Nationalism in its pure sense is pretty cool. Germans wanting a Germany, Italians wanting an Italy, the British wanting Great Britain, or the French wanting a France, and so forth. But once these European countries decided that they wanted more and more stuff, then the problem led to just ramped up nationalism, and that was the demise of other places around the world, like in Africa. Okay, so there was this concept of racism that helped with this imperialism too. In fact, one of the greatest writers of the time was a guy named Rudyard Kipling, and he wrote a very famous poem called "The White Man's Burden." And in this poem, he's really basically saying that white people needed to be paternalistic or be a conquering type people over Africa and in India and parts of Asia, and it was the duty of Africa, or excuse me, the duty of basically people from Great Britain and America, the United States, white people, to take over these places and show these people how to be civilized. So obviously today it comes across as sounding really, really bad, and I suppose it was. But The White Man's Burden is a poem you can look up. All right, social Darwinism, the same type of thing. Survival of the fittest applied to human society. There's a quote by Cecil Rhodes. You can read that on your own. That was part of the driving forces of imperialism. Okay. All right, next. The next section, the division of Africa. Okay, so the division of Africa comes up next. The Berlin Conference. So these European countries, mostly Britain and mostly France, were imperializing Africa. There seemed to be a need for a meeting. So to make sure that there wasn't such competition that they got into a war in Africa. So the bottom line is European countries got together, and it was called the Berlin Conference, 1884. Now this conference, they did not invite any African leaders to come to this. This was all European leaders. And at this conference, the European leaders basically divided up Africa and said who was going to get to go imperialize certain areas. Okay, so one of the questions that is usually asked by students is, why didn't the Africans fight back? Well, sometimes they did, but the thing that we kind of have to keep in mind here is that for years the African tribes have been fighting each other too, and this was something kind of similar to what happened in our country with our Western expansion. Native peoples in our country, Native American Indians, fought each other. And then when the white people came, some tribes sided with the white people so that they could kill their old enemies. And this happened in Africa too. There's a lot of tribalism. And so sometimes one tribe will get together with the Europeans in order to kill another tribe that they've been at war with for generations. So this is one of the reasons why Africans didn't rise up and fight back. Okay, keep in mind, always what we're talking about with imperialism is the need for raw materials. Africa had a lot of them. I named some in the last video, and also cash crop plantations. You can look at those. Okay, and then next, there are three groups that clashed over South Africa. Okay, South Africa is a very interesting place because it was founded as a colony by Dutch people from Holland, and this was back when, during the 1600s, in 1652 is when your book says they were first settled by the Dutch. This is South Africa, when the Dutch were in charge of the spice trade. Well, a lot of Dutch people moved there because there was good land in the very southern part of Africa for European type crops and European farming practices. It was during the Napoleonic times when Britain was at war with Holland that Britain ended up taking over South Africa. But the people that were in South Africa at the time, the descendants of the Dutch, they didn't leave. That was their land. They had come there in the late 1600s, and they'd stayed there. So they weren't going to leave. That was where they were from. They were white people, but they were African. The term they use, a few terms for these Dutch people. Afrikaners is one, spelled with a K, or Boers. And Boer is a Dutch word for farmer, because they were, a lot of them were farmers. But keep in mind, these white people considered themselves African just as much as I would consider myself an American. They consider themselves African. So there are three groups that we talk about. There were the Boers, there's the descendants of the Dutch. The British came in, and then there was a group called the Zulu. The Zulu were a very powerful tribe in southern Africa. Their famous chief was Shaka. There have been many movies made about the Zulus and about Shaka. Okay, so you can make sure you have those notes and expand on that. And then the last thing you want to have here, this is the bottom line here. This bottom box is you're going to want to put some things in your own words. The question is, how did Europeans use social Darwinism to justify empire building? Okay, now empire building's not the Empire Building in New York. That's not the Empire State Building. We talk about empire building, we talk about imperialism. Okay, strong countries taking over weaker countries. Okay, thank you.